Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nicole. I'm a community nutrition educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Nassau County. Today is all about blood pressure, nutrition, and stress. So I'm sure this is a hot topic for many of us, dealing with this extra stress from COVID, from quarantine. So I think it's very timely. As you have questions, you can field them in the chat box, and my coworker will field them to me as the presentation goes on. So the CDC estimates that 1 out of every 3 people in the United States above the age of 20 has hypertension, which when you put the statistic like that, it sounds pretty incredible. It's troublesome because it's a major health concern. Uncontrolled blood pressure puts you at risk for things like heart disease, stroke, which are the first and third leading causes of death in the United States. So there are many risk factors to consider when thinking about high blood pressure. So family history, if your parents or other close blood relatives had high blood pressure, there's an increased chance that you will have it too, or develop it. Age, unfortunately, we can't control that, but the older that we get, the more likely we are to develop high blood pressure. So as we get older, our blood vessels gradually lose some of that elasticity, which can contribute to increased blood pressure. But children and younger adults can also get it as well. Gender, interestingly, until age 64, men are more likely to get or develop high blood pressure than women. And at 65 or older, women are more likely to develop it. So, people like my mom, got to keep an eye on that. Race as well, again, something that we cannot control. African Americans tend to develop high blood pressure more often than other people. And it also tends to be a little bit more severe in that group. And some medications may affect that blood pressure a little bit differently. So that's also something to discuss with your doctor. Pre-existing conditions like chronic kidney disease, diabetes, sleep apnea, high cholesterol, we see that relationship. For example, chronic kidney disease, we may see that high blood pressure may be a result of that, but also high blood pressure may also cause that chronic kidney disease. So we have a little bit of that dual action happening. And we do see that 73% of those with diabetes, which is almost 20 million people in the United States, also have high blood pressure. What we're going to be focusing on today are more of those modifiable risk factors, which are lifestyle factors. Again, any questions, just add that to the chat. So there are an assortment of lifestyle factors that can affect our blood pressure. So lack of physical activity, not getting enough physical activity as part of your lifestyle can increase your risk of developing high blood pressure. Physical activity is great to keep your heart and circulatory system healthy, and blood pressure is no exception to that rule, where physical activity can help to support your blood pressure. An unhealthy diet, especially one that's high in sodium, and I have this bolded because it is something we'll focus on a little bit more today. So good nutrition from a variety of sources we all know is critical to our health, and a diet that's too high in salt, sodium, as well as calories, saturated fat, trans fat, sugar, can carry that additional risk for high blood pressure. On the other hand, making healthier food choices can actually help to lower blood pressure. So we'll dive into that in a little bit. Being overweight or obese, carrying too much weight puts extra strain on your heart and your circulatory system that can cause a number of health problems. It increases your risk for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and of course, high blood pressure. Drinking too much alcohol. Regular heavy use of alcohol can cause, again, a lot of different health problems, including things like heart failure, stroke, irregular heartbeats, and it can also cause an increase in your, dramatic increase in your blood pressure and increase your risk of other things like cancer, obesity, suicide, and accidents. Smoking and tobacco use as well. So using tobacco can cause that increase in blood pressure, even though it's temporary, but over time it can have a longer lasting effect and also contribute to damaged arteries. Even secondhand smoke, we see that as well. And stress, which again, we're gonna talk a little bit more about. Any questions so far? So stress is the body's response to change. Our bodies react by releasing adrenaline that can cause your breathing to increase, your heart rate to speed up, your blood pressure to rise in order to deal with a stressful situation. So that by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But too much stress and prolonged stress can contribute to increased blood pressure over time. And too much stress can encourage behaviors that can increase our blood pressure as well. So encouraging, poor diet, tobacco and alcohol use to help deal with that stress, physical inactivity. So again, we see that maybe cause and effect. So we want to think of a healthy way, a productive way to manage our stress. Taking steps to manage our stress can help us feel like we have a little bit more control, hopefully. So things like positive self-talk, right? Turning a negative thought into a positive thought. So instead of thinking, I can't do this, think of, I'll do the best that I can. Engaging in physical activity regularly. So physical activity affects almost every system in our body. It can help with our sleep patterns. It can help with stress management. It of course helps to keep our muscles, our heart, everything nice and strong. So pick something that you enjoy. And everybody has a different level that they are comfortable with and that is safe for them. So swimming, riding a bike, taking a walk, doing gentle yoga, chair yoga. Think of something that you like to help release that tension. Taking 15 to 20 minutes a day to sit quietly and think of something peaceful. So to sort of relax, to focus on your breathing a little bit more. Thinking ahead to maybe have a plan for something that upsets you. I know, pre-COVID, when I had sort of a regular schedule, traffic would stress me out. So I would try to find a way to either plan my errands for maybe when I knew there was less traffic, or maybe I would find a different route that I knew wouldn't stress me out as much. So trying to deal with a situation that causes you stress so that you'll be a little bit more mentally prepared. Learning to say no, which is also something that I struggle with, that I should work on personally. So learning to say no, not to promise too much, to overextend yourself to friends or family, because that can put stress on us as well. So again, if we sort of can help to balance that in our regular everyday lives, then we can sort of help to mitigate that stress. Reevaluating bad habits. So too much alcohol, cigarettes, caffeine can increase that stress, right? Same with our dietary choices, which again, we'll get into in just a little bit. Getting organized, so whether that's a to-do list for you and physically checking things off one at a time can make you feel like you've been productive and that you have less sort of on your mind. Some people like to do one big thing at a time. I'm going to clean out the closet today, and sort of you feel like you had one big task that you wanted to accomplish and it is done and off of your mind. And of course, getting enough sleep. I'm sure we would all love to consistently get 6 to 8 hours. So do your best to sort of aim for that nightly, whether that's, turning the TV off a little bit earlier, maybe that's putting your phone away to give your brain a little bit of time to relax. So the big topic for today is stress and food. Studies show that stress can affect our food preferences. For example, we do see in animal studies that physical or emotional distress can increase our affinity and therefore our intake for things that are high in fat, high in sugar, high in salt, or all of the above. And if you think about why, a lot of these are comfort and convenience food. So if you're stressed for time, something that may sort of make you feel less stressed is getting something to eat really quickly, right? You don't necessarily have the time to prepare and sit down for a balanced meal. And you are stressed out, so you want foods that comfort you. But we see that once ingested, fat and sugar-filled foods seem to have a feedback effect that inhibits the activity in parts of our brain that produce and process stress and related emotions. So part of that stress-induced craving may be that they counteract stress. So what that means is that when you eat something that's fatty or sugary, you don't feel as stressed, right? You physically have a response that maybe calms you down a little bit. So it may sort of increase that craving because not only emotionally, physically, you have a little bit of relief. Of course, I mean, overeating can also be an issue, right? As far as binge eating, but overeating isn't the only stress-related behavior that can add pounds. So stressed people lose sleep, they exercise less, they drink more alcohol, all which can contribute to weight gain. So yes, we're focusing on food, but all of these things are related. I'm sure you can see that. So we reach for those comfort foods when we're stressed. They may be, again, a little bit more processed. They're less healthy, like fast food, chips, cookies, but maybe they make us feel good in the moment. So it makes sense that research shows that high stress levels lead to weight gain in men and women. Interestingly, the effect is seen a little bit greater in men, which I thought was interesting. So if we're specifically talking about sodium, right, because of the relationship between high sodium diets and overall heart disease, blood pressure, we want to discuss where we are as a country, where we are as a culture. So 9 out of 10 Americans consume too much sodium. On average, the average American adult eats more than double the amount of recommended sodium at 3,400 milligrams per day, which is a lot. And recommendations may be anywhere from 1,500, 2,300, 2,500 milligrams per day, which will, again, I'll dive into it in a little bit. But where does the sodium come from? So you can see this image from the CDC. 65% comes from food bought in stores, so that's packaged foods. 25% comes from restaurant meals, and only 10% comes from home cooking and at the table. So if you're making soup or a stew and you add salt while you're cooking, and also when you're at the table, if you add a little bit of salt to your steak or something like that. So in home, it's only 10%. And to be a little bit more specific, 40% of the sodium we eat comes from this top 10 groups of foods. So this is the list, again, from the CDC. Breads and rolls, pizza, like frozen pizzas, sandwiches, cold cuts and cured meats, soups, burritos and tacos, savory snacks like your chips, popcorn, pretzels, chicken, cheese, and things like eggs and omelets. And a lot of these things aren't super surprising, especially understanding that most of the sodium comes from packaged foods. So I don't think too many of these were a surprise for me. The whole eggs and omelets thing is curious. I think the breakfast sphere has definitely expanded as far as frozen option for, like egg sandwiches, and even things like, Starbucks. Everybody has their breakfast sandwiches now. So when it comes to making better food choices to help manage our overall health and our blood pressure, I'm going to briefly talk about the DASH diet. So that stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And there's overwhelming evidence that this DASH diet can help to reduce blood pressure. And there are studies that suggest it can lower the risk of other chronic diseases. So, I mean, that's a win-win for me. And although this diet plan, I'll put that in quotes, hasn't been as popular in the last few years, you can see why a lot of the recommendations that fall within this diet plan fit into an overall healthy eating pattern. So the DASH diet focuses on increasing your whole foods and limiting total saturated fat and other things that are sort of associated with processed foods. So it's rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and legumes, lean proteins, low fat or fat-free dairy. You see that it limits things like red meat, processed sweets, added sugars. And interestingly, it's extremely high overall in things like potassium, calcium, magnesium, and fiber, which isn't surprising when you understand all of the other things that it focuses on, right? Fiber, of course, we get our fiber from fruits and veggies and whole grains and nuts. Calcium, if we're emphasizing low fat and fat-free dairy, and also vegetarian sources of calcium like leafy greens, you can see how this overall diet would be high in those minerals and fiber. The standard DASH diet encourages about 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day as the cap. The lower sodium DASH diet is up to 1,500 milligrams, which if you've ever taken a look at a food label and you have a few different things that you eat in a day that come from a package, 1,500 can be extremely difficult. But if you're focusing on whole foods and things that you're either making yourself or making from scratch, you can see that it might not be as hard as it sounds. Any questions? Okay. So what are we looking for? So many of those processed foods that I mentioned, like cheese, deli meats, condiments, can be a hidden source of things like calories, fat, sodium, and sugar. But we want to use the nutrition facts label and compare the label, especially when you're comparing apples to apples, not literally, but something like a loaf of bread to a loaf of bread. So you know that slice for slice where you're hitting. So you want to look for things that maybe say low sodium or no salt added. So if you look at my list here, very low sodium will be, say, 35 milligrams or less per serving. That low sodium, which I've underlined, is, say, 35 to 140, so less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving, all the way up to very high, so above 500 milligrams of sodium per serving. And you'll see that what you want is going to be less than 5% of the DV, or daily value. And as an example, this little label that we have here sort of highlights there's 460 milligrams of sodium in that 1.5 cup. I'm not sure what this is supposed to be, but that's 20%. So although, you know, it's not very high, it's not that at that 500 milligrams, it is considered high in sodium, right? It's that 250 to 500 milligrams, and it's 20% of the daily value. So those are two different ways that you can look at it. You can look at the percent daily value, or a little bit easier is just to look at that total sodium per serving. And remember, if this was, say, a bag of popcorn or a bag of chips, and you ate the entire bag, well, now you have to multiply that 460 milligrams by the number of servings. So for example, this has 4 servings. You'd multiply that by 4. That's somewhere around 1,800 milligrams. And that's, you know, especially for a snack, you're pretty much at your day's limit. I do also want to mention, actually, before I move forward, be careful of foods that say lower sodium, because lower sodium just means that it's a certain percent, I believe it's 25%, less than that reference food. So if you got a can of Campbell's soup and it's lower sodium, it's probably just lower sodium than the regular soup. So it still may be high in sodium, but they trick you a little bit. So lower soy sauce may still be a high sodium serving. So it still may have 400 to 600 milligrams per serving. They're very tricky. So keep that in mind. All right, so in addition to some of the foods that we want to increase, like those whole grains, those fruits and veggies, what else? So some of the fun stuff, dark chocolate, which I love chocolate. Anybody who knows me or ever comes to my classes knows that I love chocolate. So dark chocolate in particular contains flavanols, which is a compound that helps to widen the arteries by producing something called nitric oxide. So that there's a certain chemical that's made by cells that line our artery walls. And research does suggest that consuming moderate amounts of either unsweetened cocoa or dark chocolate with a percent of about 70 or higher can help to reduce blood pressure. So you can reap those benefits by adding unsweetened cocoa or cacao powder to baked goods, to smoothies, to that banana and ice cream that I've made before. So again, I think that's a great reason for me to have it. That doesn't mean that I go overboard and I have a ton, right? And you also have to notice what else is in that. If you're having, dark chocolate covered caramels or something, that's okay. It's delicious, but keep in mind that that's going to have more of those added sugars. So maybe moderate that a little bit. Soybeans and other soy foods. So I'm not talking about soy sauce here. I'm talking about, edamame in the shell, maybe tofu, have a lot of other heart healthy nutrients that can help to decrease blood pressure. So there's a certain amino acid called arginine, isoflavones, potassium, fiber, calcium, which we mentioned earlier, all play a role in our overall heart health. So we want to, and also that plant-based protein. So if maybe you're looking for a swap with a fattier protein, like say meat, like a piece of steak or something like that, choosing tofu can also help to substitute that, that fattier protein you're looking at. Fish, nuts, and seeds, of course, with their omega-3s. So those PUFAs, because I like to say PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, are inversely related to blood pressure. So increasing your omega-3s may not do as much as an overall DASH diet and a reduction in sodium, but we do see that omega-3s can help to lower blood pressure a few millimeters. So even a few millimeters helps, right? If you have high blood pressure. So thinking about walnuts, almonds, let's see, hemp seeds, flax seeds, right? We're gonna get those not only polyunsaturated, but also monounsaturated. So all of those healthy fats, avocados, of course, and herbs and spices. So herbs and spices have a whole host of phytochemicals, which are biologically active compounds found in plants. And there are a ton out there. And I do have a few that I've highlighted here, depending on the herb or spice. So the leaf of the plant, if you're not familiar, is usually referred to as a culinary herb, and other parts of the plant like bark, bud, roots are considered a spice. So they've been used for thousands of years in traditional medicines, and they have those antioxidant, antimicrobial, antiviral effects. And so we see here curcumin, which you see in cumin. We have something called curcuminoids, which makes a lot of sense. Cayenne has capsaicin. Interestingly, ginger also has capsaicin. So if you've ever had fresh ginger and it has a little bit of a bite, a little spice to it, that's from that capsaicin, which gives cayenne and ginger that spicy flavor. Garlic also has things like allicin, allicin, allyl sulfides, quercetin, peppermint, oregano, cinnamon, rosemary. They all have these phytochemicals and antioxidants. But we do want to remember that we want to consume herbs and spices for their antioxidant content and not necessarily a specific health benefit, right? I'm not going to put garlic in every meal and cross my fingers and hope, that it's going to prevent me from getting blood pressure. It is something extra to boost the nutrient profile of your foods, your snacks, and they also help to add things like brightness and flavor without needing salt, fat, extra sugar from those condiments or other additives. So, like I said, herbs and spices add depth of flavor, brightness, heat, and experimenting in the kitchen with different cuisines, changing up the spices can keep things interesting, keep your palate from getting bored. And again, we're not reaching necessarily for those salty, fatty, sugary condiments. So before I do the demonstration for today, I just want to highlight some herb-based sauces or dips from around the world. So chimichurri is an Argentinian sauce that we typically see with parsley, oregano, garlic, onion, red pepper, vinegar. Pesto, of course, a traditional Italian pesto will have pine nuts, garlic, basil, extra virgin olive oil, Parmesan cheese. Pine nuts can get a little pricey, so I will substitute sometimes whatever I have around. So I'll make it with walnuts or cashews, and don't tell my, my Italian grandmother, but I think it's okay if you don't use pine nuts. Chermoula, which is Moroccan. Again, lots of herbs, cilantro, parsley, lemon juice, different herbs. And if you notice something that's similar between a lot of these, a lot of them have multiple herbs, almost all of them have garlic, some sort of acid, and usually a healthy fat. I mean, the healthy fat that I usually use in my sauce is going to be either an olive oil or an avocado oil. So again, this is going to add a lot of flavor to marinades, to tacos, potatoes, meats, without adding a ton of salt, without adding a lot of butter, without adding, extra sugar. Okay, so I'm going to run and wash my hands before I do the demo. So if anybody has questions, you can put that into the chat, and when I come back, we will discuss. Are there any questions? Okay. Also going to change the view so everyone can see what I'm working on. So I am using my little food processor today. Ooh.
Nicole, do you want to stop sharing?
Yes, I do. Thank you. All right, I'm just going to adjust this and hopefully you can let me know if that looks okay. Does that look okay?
Looks good.
Okay.
Perfect.
So I'm using my little food processor, which actually I just have to grab the top of it. So I'm using a mini food processor, and I am making a relatively small batch of this sauce. So I can't call it a chimichurri because a chimichurri traditionally has oregano. And while I do have oregano in my garden, I just prefer the combination of cilantro and parsley. So that's what I'm going to be using today.
Before you start, Nicole, somebody raised their hand. Sandra, I don't know if you have a question.
Absolutely.
Or it was an accident, possibly. If you do, Sandra, you can put it in the chat or the Q&A. And if it was an accident, that's fine. Okay, I'll let you know, Nicole, if anybody asks a question.
Okay, and I will share this recipe as well, but I'm starting with about 3 cloves of garlic, 1 jalapeno from my garden, which I have cut up a little bit, and you can see that most of the seeds I took out, but I do like things a little spicy, so I left some of them in there. You can completely leave the pepper out if you don't want anything spiced and you just want something a little more herbaceous. I have about half a lime. It's going to translate to hopefully about 1.5 tablespoons of lime juice. I've already combined a little bit of maple syrup and avocado oil. And then I have some cilantro and parsley. Some people love cilantro, some people absolutely hate it. So again, you can substitute something like dill, a totally different herb if you don't like cilantro. So I'm basically going to be combining everything together, and then I have a little bit of water reserved on the side to thin everything out. So again, we're getting, antioxidants, all this good stuff from different herbs, from the garlic. And it's a fun way to use stuff from your garden in case you're growing some peppers, maybe jalapenos, maybe you're growing shishitos, who knows? Okay, I'm just gonna add that, a little bit of maple syrup and avocado oil, and I'm gonna juice half that lime. And this is a relatively new gadget. I know it's probably something very simple, but instead of having to just hand squeeze everything, this, along with a garlic mincer, this is incredible. Because I wind up wasting a lot of my citrus because I can't get all the juice out. So I'm going to add a tiny bit of water, probably about a tablespoon or 2 at a time. And then I'm going to put myself on mute while I process because it can be a little noisy. I'm going to mute. I'm going to add a little bit of the parsley that I have left. And again, this is sort of a small batch. I tend to double this depending on what I have around or what I'm making it for. And it keeps for a day or 2. So if I use it in tacos, maybe the next day I'll use it on, on top of a kebab. So it doesn't hurt to make a little bit more. So I made something similar to this on a previous very short video. And what I also did share is that you can, if you have half of an avocado laying around, if you have just maybe a few slices of avocado, you can take this from more of a herb sauce and make it sort of a creamy topping. So that would be, I think for tacos, that would be perfect in my perspective, from my perspective.
Nicole, you have a question.
Yes.
So somebody is asking, when filling out a form that asks, do you have high blood pressure? What do you answer if your meds have regulated it so that is a completely normal range now?
So it's almost a similar question as to whether or not you have diabetes, because once you have controlled your diabetes, you still have it, especially if you're on something to help regulate it. So you do, like my mom, who wishes she didn't, but she does. she checks that box. So she has her blood pressure under control, but you still have high blood pressure, because if you went off that medication, which I am not suggesting you do, right, your blood pressure would not be normal like we would like it to be. So that's still technically, it's controlled. So maybe if there's a little comment section, you can mention that it's controlled with medication, but you still have it. Anybody else? You're welcome. And I'll put that, I'm going to share my screen again, and I'll put that recipe in case anybody wanted to have, if anybody had a question about the recipe. Again, I'm going to share it with, I'll share it to our website, and I'll also share it with OFA. So maybe we can post it to the Facebook page. All right, if there aren't any other questions, maybe we can stop recording. And again, this recording will be available in a few hours, probably this evening, on the ccenasa.org website under virtual learning. And I will make sure that the recipe is available as well.